If anyone joins, has the ability to mute and unmute themselves. Attendees, if you have any questions, please use the raise hand feature. Questions will be answered in the order in which hands are raised after the staff presentation. Christine, back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Stefan. Good evening, everyone. My name is Christine Coe. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the City Budget and Program Evaluation Manager in the City Finance Department. Today is the second of two public information sessions on the 2023 budget. If you're joining us, there are two ways to participate. If you'd like to join by Zoom, you can participate in the Q&A at the end of the information session. The meeting ID is 839-0606-9914, and the passcode is 703918. You can also stream live on YouTube or the city's media site channel, and that you can find that at youtube.com/City of Madison, and we'll also post the recordings there after the fact so you can share with colleagues or neighbors. Our agenda today, I was planning to start with a brief round of introductions with our panelists, but we actually don't have any staff or alders on with us tonight because there are a number of conflicting meetings with the city with different committees. So if folks join us later in the presentation, I'll pause and ask them to introduce themselves. But we'll actually dive right into the presentation. Section 1 is a high-level overview of the city budget process. I'll talk about the difference between the capital and operating budgets, the annual budget development timeline, and how to navigate our website and resources. And then we'll dive into some of the specifics on the capital and operating budgets. We'll talk about what some of the priority areas for each are for each of the budgets and how the budget is designed to meet community needs. Then we'll do a brief expenditure summary, which is, what are we paying for and how much does it cost? And we'll also have a revenue summary, which will discuss how we're paying for each of these priority areas. And finally, we'll end the presentation with a discussion on how the budget impacts the average household and property taxes. And again, if you're joining with through the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. Ultimately, the budget is a big, complicated document. It's over 650 pages long between the capital and operating books. And so we won't be able to cover everything in one session, even if we had longer than the 90 minutes we've scheduled. Ultimately, we hope that you walk away with an understanding of the overall process, how you can get involved through the public hearings, and understand a little bit about the 2023 priorities. So with that, I'll just jump right into part 1. So Budget 101. What is the budget? How is it funded? And what does it pay for? So the first thing to know about the city budget is that we actually have two budgets, a capital budget and an operating budget. Both of these are planning documents that lay out how the city will spend money in the upcoming year to provide services and advance city priorities. The budget is required by state law, and the capital and operating budget covers 1 year of spending from January 1st to December 31st. The capital budget also includes what's called a capital improvement plan, or CIP, sometimes shortened to CIP, that has a 5-year outlook. And that's because of the nature of capital projects. They tend to have a long time horizon and take multiple years to complete. So having a 5-year plan lets us strategize for investments over time. Ultimately, the budget is developed by city staff. Every single agency plays an active role in developing their budget. It's not just developed in the vacuum of the finance department. We get input on all of the components from city staff, from department heads down through the organization. And the budget that's presented, that we've presented to the public so far, is the executive budget that's been introduced by the mayor. And that executive budget is ultimately reviewed, amended, and approved by the Common Council, who are the city's elected legislative body. And one final point is that the annual operating budget must be balanced, which means our expenses, what we spend, can't exceed or be higher than how much we bring in through revenues. So the capital budget funds the city's physical infrastructure and assets like roads, bike lanes, parks and city facilities, affordable housing, and more. It also includes technology and equipment needs and other programs like the municipal art funds. If you see city construction, like a major road reconstruction or stormwater mitigation efforts, this project is likely in the city budget, or it's likely in the capital budget. And the capital budget is important because it ensures that our infrastructure, things like roads and bridges, are safe and effective. And it also helps the city advance goals around issues like climate change and affordable housing. The capital budget is primarily funded through borrowing. The city issues debt, general obligation debt, to borrow funds to pay for these projects that's repaid over time. Other funds that pay for capital items include things like special assessments, impact fees, user fees, as well as state and federal grants. The operating budget funds everyday services to residents. So things like staff time, as well as funding for community organizations that provide services on behalf of the city, are paid for through the operating budget. As well as supplies, equipment, and other costs needed to deliver services to residents. And the operating budget is important because it provides the core services that you might think of when you think of how the city operates. So things like garbage and recycling pickup, offering park and library programs, public health and public safety. These are all funded in the operating budget. It also funds core civic activities like administering elections through the clerk's office, and much more. The city's operating budget is primarily funded through property taxes that comprises almost 3/4 of the revenues. Other charges for services, user fees, and federal and state aid also contribute to the budget. One analogy I like to use to compare the city budget to a personal budget is to think of a capital budget like buying a house or a car. When you take out a mortgage, when you want to buy a house or a car, most people will take out a mortgage or a car loan. You're taking out debt to invest in a long-term asset. Most folks aren't paying for that out of pocket. After you take out the debt, you pay back that mortgage or car loan on a regular basis, usually in monthly installment. And at the end of 10 or 30 years, you own that asset. On the operating side, this is more like paying for your day-to-day expenses out of your checking account. So things like rent, mortgage payments, food, utilities are things you need on a daily or regular basis. And if you pay for it out of your checking account, you're using money you have in the bank instead of borrowing money to pay for these costs. Similarly, the operating budget that's funding our daily activities is more like a regular household budget. And these two budgets do interact with each other. In the city budget, repaying debt for capital investments is a section in the budget called debt service. And this is included in the operating budget, similar to how your monthly mortgage payment shows up in your checkbook. In terms of the timeline for developing the budget, it takes about a year to develop the budget that covers a year of spending. Each year starts with what we call a cost to continue projection. And this is figuring out how much it would cost to provide the same level of service next year. So the budget and finance team spends the early part of the year developing these projections and doing some working with the mayor's office and others on priority setting. In the spring, between April and July, we handed over to the agencies to develop their own capital and operating budgets, where they identify what the priorities are for their agencies and identify any changes in their operations. Throughout the summer, agencies present their budget to the mayor's office, and the mayor prepares the executive budget, which is introduced to the Common Council in September and October. So then throughout the fall, there are a number of budget hearings, public hearings, where the public has the opportunity to ask questions and engage in the budget process. And the council also has the opportunity to submit amendments and ultimately approves the budget in November. Throughout the year, there are formal and informal ways for the public to participate in budget development. One is that many city staff engage directly with residents to understand service needs. That can be through groups like neighborhood resource teams, through resident surveys, through planning meetings and other community engagement efforts. And these are really key inputs into budget priorities because it lets agencies know, what the current needs are, what issues the public is bringing to the table. And then another formal mechanism is for members of the public to participate in the budget through public testimony, which occurs at several meetings, both through the Finance Committee and Common Council. And here we have a detailed timeline for the Finance Committee and Common Council hearings. I won't go through each of the dates, but the main steps for both the capital and operating budget are the same. The first is that the mayor introduces the executive budget to the Common Council. For capital, that happened on September 6th, and operating happened earlier this month on October 11th. And then there are a series of Finance Committee hearings where the agency presents their budget to the Finance Committee, and the alders have the opportunity to engage in Q&A. In operating, that occurred last week on Monday and Tuesday, the 17th and 18th. After the Common Council does their presentation, then we have a week of amendments where alders can present requests to their budget analysts. Alders can submit requests to amend the budget either by adding new projects, reallocating funding, or removing funding for specific projects or services. We are currently in the amendment process for the operating budget. Amendments are due by the middle of this week, and we'll publish amendments by the end of this week. And then step 4 is having Finance Committee deliberations on amendments. So next Monday on Halloween, we'll have a Finance Committee meeting where the alders will discuss and deliberate all of the amendments for the operating budget. After both the capital and operating budget go through the Finance Committee process, the budgets are referred back to the Common Council. So it goes back to the full 20-person council, and the alders will have another opportunity to submit amendments. And then there's a series of meetings in mid-November where the council does the final deliberations and adoption of the budget. This year, those meetings are November 15th, 16th, and 17th. So members of the public, again, can engage through the public hearing process. This year, the next public comment period is going to be tomorrow, October 25th, at the Common Council meeting. The registration is open. If you go to cityofmadison.com/meeting registration, select the October 25th Common Council meeting, and you can sign up to speak during the regular public comment period or during the public hearing on the budget. Again, after the 25th, the item will be referred back to the Finance Committee on October 31st. So you can address specific issues with the operating budget at that point. And then you can also speak at the November 1st Common Council meeting, as well as the November 15th Common Council meeting. And finally, you can find all of our budget materials online at cityofmadison.com/budget. And I'm going to switch my screen share to walk through a couple of the key resources that we have available on our website. So again, if you go to cityofmadison.com/budget, you will see our homepage that has a button to the 2023 budget. We had a little blurb about the information sessions that are happening today, as well as if you wanted to look at a specific phase in the capital or operating budget, you can see the timeline here for each of the phases, and then you can select one of the links. And so I selected the 2023 operating budget, so I can see you can either look at the full executive budget. A document I highly recommend folks review is the executive budget, is the executive summary. And this is about a 20-page document that highlights some of the key aspects of the budget. I think it's much more digestible than the full several hundred-page book. And it includes the mayor's message as well as some high-level points. And then you'll see some overview pages, some information around the city tax rate, special fund statements, and then operating budgets by agency. And here, if you are interested in a specific agency, like if you want to know what's happening with community development or economic development, you can select on these PDFs, and it gives you, again, a much more condensed view of the budget, so you don't have to review the whole document for what you're looking for. One thing I like to point out in the capital budget is that one nice feature we have is something called the story map. So if you go to the 2023 capital budget, you can see this project map link, and that opens this ArcGIS map page where we actually show you geographically where some of the key projects are located. So you can zoom into different parts of the city. If you select any of the points or lines, you can see, what projects are planned, how much of that project costs, how it aligns with different city elements in our comprehensive plan. So here I have a lift station rehabilitation that's aligned with our green and resilient goals. And I can see that it's about $250,000 and linked to the budget book. So you can zoom around in different areas of the city. And we also have these embedded charts and graphs using Power BI visuals. And if you select any of the features, you can get a little bit more detail on the budget. So this is something that I think it's interesting to see how some of these projects are located around the city. And finally, one last resource I wanted to point out is that if you go to the city's media site, if you wanted to watch any of the city proceedings on the budget, you can always review the presentations to the finance committee. So you can see here that the meetings on October 17th and 18th, where agencies were providing briefings on the budget, had a number of views, and you can always go back and watch those presentations as well. All right, so I'm going to switch back to the slides. And before I go on to the next section, I see that Dave has joined us. I'm going to ask Dave to introduce himself.
Thanks, Christine. Hello, everyone. My name is David Schmidtke. I'm the finance director for the city of Madison. I'm happy to be with you this evening to talk about the city budget. And I'll be talking to you later about portions of the budget after Christine works through the rest of this presentation. Thanks, Christine.
Great, thanks, Dave. All right, so then we'll go into part 2, which is highlights of the capital budget. So in this section, I'll share a little bit about what the priorities are for the budget, how the budget meets some community needs, as well as talk about how we're paying for it and what we're paying for. So 3 of the capital budget priority areas that were highlighted in the mayor's message and the executive budget include affordable housing. This includes increasing funding for development, as well as taking a multifaceted approach to serving residents who are experiencing homelessness. All of the investments in this area fall under the Community Development Division, which is one of the city agencies. The second priority area is focused around building a resilient city that's able to withstand the impacts of climate change, as well as reduce our carbon emissions and the impact our city operations have on greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a broader range of programs and projects that involve transportation and engineering. And the final category is building strong neighborhoods, which includes investing in city assets like libraries, parks, and community centers to serve residents where they live. So digging into each of these areas a little bit more, within the affordable housing category, one exciting aspect of this budget is that it increases the annual contribution to the Affordable Housing Development Fund to $10 million a year, which over the course of the 6-year capital improvement plan is $60 million. And this is a pretty significant increase compared to the 2022 budget, where the annual contribution was $7 million a year. So this is over the total capital improvement plan is an increase of $18 million. Another really exciting project is that it secures funding for the city's first purpose-built homeless shelter. This project was introduced several budgets ago, and it piecemealed funding from multiple sources over years. And this budget brings together the final pieces needed to construct a $21 million facility beginning in 2024. And it uses county and federal sources as well as city contributions. The budget also continues affordable housing consumer lending programs. So this is assisting seniors and people on fixed incomes, as well as assisting folks who need help with housing rehabilitating their housing. And this investment is $19 million over 6 years. And the final component in this category is investing in land banking, which is $1 million a year or $6 million over the course of the SIP that helps acquire land for future economic development and affordable housing projects, and is a strategy to combat displacement and gentrification. In the resilient city category, I'm not going to read through all of these projects, but a few to highlight include over $22 million for flood mitigation. Since the 2018 flood, the city has been rapidly increasing the number of projects it completes annually to focus on key streets and drainage areas to mitigate flooding. The budget includes a $23 million federal grant to ensure that the full fleet of bus rapid transit buses are fully electric, which again will minimize the city's greenhouse gas emissions and work towards a green and resilient city. And as we're electrifying our city fleet, it's also important to make sure that we have the necessary charging infrastructure so that we can continue this investment. So there's a new program to focus on electric vehicle charging in the city. And there's also funding for Amtrak station planning and an intercity bus terminal to provide multimodal transit options for residents, as well as continuing funding for water quality investments, including addressing PFAS pollution and sodium and chloride. And the final priority area is focused on building strong neighborhoods. Many of the investments in this category were built on input from the neighborhood resource teams. If you're not familiar, the neighborhood resource teams are groups that are designed to promote racial equity and improve the quality of life for Madison residents by understanding and elevating the needs and issues and priorities of people living in NRTs. And these groups include residents as well as staff who participate in meetings and help elevate issues. And some of the investments in this category in the Sandburg area include $15 million towards the construction of the Madison Public Library's Imagination Center. And there's a $5 million expansion of the Warner Park Community Center, as well as some targeted funding for stormwater system improvements to alleviate issues with flooding in the Hammersley-Teresa area. So this chart is pulled from the story map that I showed a little bit earlier, and it shows that the 2023 capital budget includes about $368 million in funding for all of the different projects that I had mentioned. And over the course of the capital improvement plan, which is 6 years, there's 1.27 billion of investment. And this chart here breaks out the investments by year as well as by category. So these categories are based on the city's comprehensive plan and what we call the elements of a great city. So you can see that in 2023, the land use and transportation budget is over $212 million. And land use and transportation is always the biggest category of capital improvements, just due to the nature of what's in the capital budget. And then you can see the subsequent investments in neighborhood and housing, economy and culture, and the rest of the elements. So one thing to point out with the budget is that the 2023 executive budget is pretty significantly larger than what was adopted last year in 2022. This graph breaks out a comparison of 23, what's in the 23 plan versus the 22 plan. And this magenta color on the right shows what's proposed in 23 versus what was proposed last year in the blue. So you can see that pretty much every year of the CIP, this year's budget is proposing a higher amount. A few reasons for this is one, the 23 budget assumes pretty significant federal and state funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law and other federal grant programs. And it also accounts for the fact that inflation is driving up the cost of pretty much all of our projects. Some major projects in 2023 include about $48.6 million for a State Street garage, the $23 million in federal funding that I mentioned for the bus rapid transit fleet to ensure that those buses are electric, $11 million in additional funding for the men's shelter, a prospective $20 million grant for Safe Streets for All, which is in traffic engineering to advance some of the Vision Zero work, an additional $10 million to address inflation within the BRT, the bus rapid transit project, and $7.8 million for the Village on Park redevelopment. And one other thing to point out on this graph is that this hashed line indicates funding from federal sources or non-borrowing sources. So you can see that this amount grows pretty significantly because of all of the federal grants that we're anticipating. And you can also see that we've added 2028 to the plan, which adds about $101 million of new borrowing. And in one of my earlier slides, I mentioned that general obligation borrowing or GO borrowing is a primary source of funding for the capital budget. So GO borrowing is secured by the city's property tax base and accounts for a little more than half of the capital improvement plan. It's about 56%. The next source is intergovernmental sources, which accounts for about $207 million, and these include things like federal and state grants, like I've mentioned, as well as sources from the county and other smaller programs. This next category of other includes sources such as proceeds from the tax increment districts and impact fees. And then there are reserves applied in revenue bonds that particularly impact our utilities. So now that we've gone through the high levels of the operating budget, and actually, Dave, I'm going to ask you to take this on if that's all right with you.
Sure, that's fine.
All right. So Dave will walk through the priorities, expenditures, and revenues of the operating budget.
All right, so the operating budget, the executive operating budget's priority areas are safer communities, and that includes the expansion of the mental health emergency response in the fire department. We'll talk a little bit about that on subsequent slides. Continuing investments in violence prevention efforts and operating budget support for various capital investments using federal monies through the city's Vision Zero initiative. Another priority area is healthier neighborhoods. The overall budget has no reductions to service levels. It also has a significant investment in reproductive health access through funding for the joint city-county public health department. And through both the capital and operating budget funds affordable housing, additional affordable housing units, as well as a new affordability program to help low-income individuals and families with paying a portion of the cost of municipal services fees, such as water and sewer bills. And then there's also priority area in the budget around opportunities for youth. The city started a what's called a Parks Alive program this past summer on a pilot basis to really provide much more programming for all residents of Madison in our parks. And this provides a permanent program coordinator in the upcoming budget, as well as support funding for that effort. And the budget also expands young adult employment opportunities through contracts with nonprofit organizations to help connect young adults with jobs. And this is really seen as an area where additional resource investment is necessary. So in the Building Safer Communities area, the CARES program, which is an acronym for the Community Alternative Response Emergency Services, basically a mental health response unit that's housed in the fire department. It's now, it has started on a pilot basis, and the budget continues its expansion to a full 7 days a week, 12 hours a day to help with those needs. The budget supports, again, public health efforts around violence prevention, and then community development divisions efforts around an isthmus safety initiative. The city has been moving aggressively to reduce roadway and street injuries and deaths through its and is seeking a considerable amount of federal funding through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And if that funding is received, the city would create a project manager to really help jumpstart the various capital projects associated with the Vision Zero effort. And then in this area, the budget also supports a city emergency manager. This had been a part of other positions in the city up to this time. And this would be a new dedicated position for all sorts of emergencies, including those related to weather and climate change. As we build healthier neighborhoods, again, no reductions to city services such as stormwater and trash and recycling pickup and library services and so on. Those are continued at current levels in the proposed budget. There is a reproductive health clinic expansion, additional staffing, and more hours to help with this important effort in the face of recent Supreme Court decision. Continuing funding for affordable housing, as I mentioned, as well as operating support for new facilities to provide facilities for the homeless. And then there's a new program subject to approval by the Public Service Commission, which would again, provide assistance for paying municipal service bills for qualifying individuals. And then, as I mentioned, creating opportunities for youth around the Parks Alive program. This came from the the city's neighborhood resource teams. Those are located in certain neighborhoods around the city, and this was the priority that they put forward, and Mayor has included it in the executive budget, as well as a expansion of young adult employment programs, which did receive some allocation from the city's American Rescue Plan Act funding. And this would make a permanent program by providing an additional $250,000 for this effort. So when we step back and look at the big picture on the executive operating budget, we focus on the general and library fund because that's where most of city services are funded. And this is where most of the city revenues are located, particularly property taxes and other local revenues and state aid. It's a little under $382 million, the budget that's proposed. And the budget does have other funds through our utilities, such as sewer and stormwater, as well as federal grants, our internal services activities, such as our fleet and tax increment financing and others. That's not in this $382 million. And when we look at the general library fund budget, compare it to the current year budget, 2022, it's about a 6% increase, a little over $21 million. And it's in those three areas of the graph on the right-hand side of the slide. There's a little under 10 million in one-time items, and about a quarter of this increase is to pay for debt service, basically paying back the borrowing that we use to pay for capital projects such as reconstructing our streets or supporting new facilities around the city, such as new library facilities and so on. And then a little under 30% of this increase sort of netted with a number of different changes are increases in employee compensation as well as program expansions. And you can see the dollar amounts there in each of those categories. Under state law, the city can only increase its property tax amount subject to certain factors in the state law requirements. And the executive budget leaves about $415,000 that has not been utilized under that levy limit and remains for the council to possibly use through its amendment process to the executive operating budget proposals. So that's the big picture. How does it break down by functional area in terms of the increase or the total budget? And you can see that there with the largest share of the budget, a little over 42% for public safety and health. That'll include the city's police and fire departments, as well as the city's share of the joint city-county public health department and the funding for the Office of the Independent Police Monitor, as well as the Police Civilian Oversight Board. Next largest category is debt service, which represents about 17% roughly of the operating budget. And the third largest shares are public works. So that's going to be the engineering division. The largest portion of that is going to be for our streets division. So snow plowing, refuse and recycling pickup, and other activities like that. And then you can see the other elements of the budget there, ranging from core administrative services and planning and development, our libraries, which is in public facilities, and transportation, which includes transit and traffic engineering. Miscellaneous and direct appropriations to capital, you'll see that there. It's a little under $20 million. That's where we centrally budget employee pay increases and certain benefit costs in that category. Personnel costs, no surprise, represent almost 2/3 of the budget, so paying the people employed by the city to deliver city services. So we talked about big picture, the expenditures and expenditures by function. How do those expenditures get funded? Almost 3/4 of the budget, the general library fund budget, comes from property taxes. Another 16% is what we call local revenues. So those will be things like parking violations, building permits, and other sort of licenses and local taxes, the city's share of room taxes, for example. This accounts for about $63 million of total revenues. Intergovernmental revenues are state aids, particularly what we call a shared revenue, as well as general transportation aids. And that's about $42 million or 11% of that revenue stream. And then we have a small amount of what we call fund balance apply. This is one-time funding, and it's coming from a surplus in life and wage insurance programs for employees. And that's about $3.4 million, and that'll be used for a one-time payment to employees in 2023. We are seeing within that local revenue category some solid recovery from the economic effects of the pandemic. These include charges for services, ambulance fees, for example, building permits, as I said earlier, room taxes, which are were reduced by about 70% in 2020 due to the pandemic, and those are recovering strongly and are expected to return to pre-pandemic levels in 2023. But overall, these amounts are up about $7 million or 15% in 2023. And these do exclude one-time revenues received both in 2022 and in 2023. So now we'll kind of talk about, so that's the revenue and expenditure picture. And what does this mean in terms of particularly the property tax levy and increase and what those taxes on an average home are going to mean, and what are those state mandated budget limitations? So as I mentioned earlier, 3/4 of the city's general fund budget comes from property taxes. The state limits what cities can use for general revenues pretty much to property taxes. That's in contrast to cities in other states around the country, which have a number of other general revenue options, predominantly local option sales tax, for example. What we have seen in all cities across the state is that state aid is very much a declining share of local budgets, so a much greater reliance on property taxes, and that growth in property taxes limited under state law. We have to have a balanced budget, obviously, where revenues equal expenditures. And we talked a little bit about debt service earlier, and that debt service is basically the repayment of borrowing issued to finance capital projects. So as the capital budget, if we have a larger capital budget over time, we're going to have higher debt service, and that'll be a higher share of the budget. So when we put together the budget, one piece of that is setting what the property tax levy amount is going to be, and then translating that into an impact on each property that pays taxes around the city is the process here, and calculating the tax rate. So first of all, the property tax is increasing under the executive budget by about 5.5%. And as we mentioned earlier, that's within the maximum amount allowed under state law. And that allowable increase is calculated looking at what's called the value of new construction in the city. So the amount of new multifamily housing or commercial buildings or single family homes, whatever the value of that is. And looking at that as a share of the overall taxable or equalized value in the city, gives a percentage, and that's the maximum we can increase the levy. Now, the debt service on general obligation borrowing that we have used to finance the capital budget, that debt service is excluded from that levy limit calculation. The assessed value in the city is increasing pretty dramatically, about 14%. And so that obviously will drive the rate down. So we have an assessed value of about $35.5 billion. That number will be finalized in the next few weeks through the work of the city assessor's office. It also includes that portion of the town of Madison, which will no longer exist a week from today. And that portion of the town that's coming into the city of Madison is also a part of calculating that overall assessed value. So dividing the property tax levy that's in the 2023 executive operating budget, the 5.5% increase, by the $35.5 billion of assessed value, gives a tax rate of about a little under 7.7 mils. And so that's about basically a little less than 0.8%. And that's an increase or a decrease in the tax rate of about 7.5%. We are seeing strong growth in property taxes, about $14 million of that 5.5% rate. And it's the graph on this slide shows kind of the comparison of components. The blue portion of both bars is that net new construction. So we're seeing stronger net new construction, so more construction value happening in the city in 2022. And that enters into the levy limit calculation. The sort of tan portion is debt service, which is going up quite a bit, about $8.7 million. A portion of that is due to a refinancing of debt for water utility projects that had been funded by what are called revenue bonds. And these will now be funded by general obligation bonds. They'll have an economic savings for the water utility as well as affecting the levy limit as you see here. So that's about a third of that increase. And then the red portion of the bar is unique to the 2023 budget, and that's the effect of adding the property from the town of Madison into the levy limit. So the city of Madison will be able to increase that levy limit to account for the fact that it is taking on services to the town. And that's about 2.2 million of this overall increase. So when we look at the change in the overall property tax levy over time, this is a 20-year look. The average is about 4.1% over time, and you can see how that's varied above or below the average. And this year is above the average. Mentioned earlier the strong growth in property values, up about 14%. The average value home has increased by 12.4%. And when we sort of look at overall property value in the city and how it's allocated by type, again, more than a majority is associated with residential property value. Commercial property value is about a little over a third, and much of that is tied to multifamily buildings, apartment buildings, and so also related to residential. And then manufacturing, agricultural, and personal property are a very small share of the city's tax base. So when we look at that tax on the average value home, basically taking that tax rate we talked about earlier, multiplying that by the average home value, that then generates a tax on that average value home. And you can see that, again, over the past 20 years, the average change has been about 3.6%. And what's proposed in the executive operating budget would be slightly below 4%. So a little bit above the average over the past 20 years. And you can see how that compares to prior years. And then just a reminder that when we are talking about the property tax levy, taxes on the average value home, the tax rate, that is only for the city of Madison share of the total tax bill within the city. And so the city's levy is a little over a third of the tax bill. The largest share of the tax bill comes from schools, with the largest school district in the city being the Madison Metropolitan School District. But there are another 6 school districts within the city limits of Madison. And depending on where property is located, it may be have a tax on it from one of those other school districts. So that will be known over the next few weeks as those jurisdictions finalize their budgets. In particular, the school districts are waiting for state aid numbers from the Department of Public Instruction as they set their levies, and then a final property tax rate is set and tax bills sent out in December.
All right. Thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you.
So we got through our main presentation, and I see that a few alders have joined us. So before we go to question and answer, I'm going to ask Alder Carter and Alder Figueroa-Cole if you could take a minute to introduce yourself. And while you're doing that, if any folks who are watching via live stream want to join the webinar to participate in Q&A, you can go to Zoom, enter meeting ID 839-0606-9914 and passcode 703918. And that'll bring you into the room to join for Q&A. So first, I'll start with Alder Carter. Can you introduce yourself, let folks watching know which district you represent, and if there are any priorities or things that you're excited about in this year's budget? And Alder Carter, if you're speaking, you are on mute.
Oh,
there you are.
That mute button gets me every time. Thank you. I'm Alder for District 14, and roughly is South Madison, but it goes from Bridge Road, the border of Monona, all the way up the Beltline, almost to Seminole Highway. One of the things that I'm really looking at when it comes to the budget this year, and although we have to use some restraint with amendments and things like that, but I'm really looking at how we can really support the temporary homeless shelter, including the permanent homeless shelter, how we can improve public safety with the various programs that the chief has presented to us. And then finally, really looking at staff and employment and training. Those are the things that I'm looking forward to. What gets me excited, and some of the things that are happening next year in our parks. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder Carter. Alder Figueroa-Cole, can you let us know what district you represent and anything you're excited about in this year's budget? And you're on mute.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, Dave. So I'm in District 10, which covers all the way from Meadowwood to Arbor Hills, and in between that, you'll find Orchard Ridge, Summit Woods, Ally Drive, Don's March area, and Nakoma. It's quite a large district. So the one thing a couple of things that I'm very excited about the budget this year is the increase on community services, specifically to cover the youth employment. So there's $200,000 additional to those funds. So I'm very excited about that. I'm super excited about the continuation of Parks Alive. I think that was quite a nice pilot we run this summer, extremely successful to maintain the city parks vibrant and active, creating good trouble in them. So I really enjoy a lot of that this summer. And I'm looking forward to continue to see that in the coming years. As for the budget in general, as a general process, I'm actually, kind of a nerd about that. So I'm actually enjoying that a little bit. I'm trying to just really looking forward to amendments and finalizing the numbers and getting through it. So if you guys have any questions, you can find us in our web pages online on the city website. You can reach us through the email addresses or the information that we have posted. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Alder Figueroa Cole. And thank you both, Alder Carter and Figueroa Cole, for joining tonight. I know that there are lots of meetings and lots of things going on, and you're both just so active and involved in the budget process as members of the Finance Committee, and I appreciate you showing up. So now we'll move to Q&A. If you are an attendee in the webinar and you'd like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature. And we'll give folks a few minutes. And so please go ahead and raise your hand if you would like to ask a question of myself, Dave, or any of the alders. Stefan, it looks like Alder Miadze is in the meeting as an attendee. If you could elevate him so he can introduce himself.
Yep. So Alder Miadze, yep, you should have a prompt. There you go. Cool.
Hi, Alder Miadze. Thank you so much for joining us. We were just pausing for resident questions, but if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, let us know what district you're from and if there's anything you're looking forward to in this year's budget process.
Hello, everybody. Alder Miadze of District 18. I'm just eager to hear everybody's questions so I can definitely advocate for what the residents' concerns are. So, and thank you for Finance to actually have this meeting outreaching our residents of the city. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So again, if you are watching the live stream, you can join Zoom using the meeting ID or passcode on the slide. If you're already in the Zoom and you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. It looks like people are being shy today. Before we close out, I'll ask the alders a question. Is there anything that you wish you knew when you were starting out and getting engaged with the budget? A piece of advice you have for a resident on how to engage in the process, or any tips you want to share out?
Give me a second. I know I can come up with a couple of things. Just 1 second.
All right. Alder Carter, it looks like you unmuted. Do you have any advice or tips on getting engaged?
One thing I would say is even before I became an alder, to get a better understanding how the budget affects your area, your neighborhood, etc. Because I think a lot of times as a resident, you don't think it's going to impact you specifically, but the budget is very much something that affects the whole city. And I wish I would have done a deeper dive into the budget when I was just a resident before I became an alder. Once I became an alder, it was enlightening, right, of the things that I just said. And I think that as a resident, you're able to really ask the not necessarily the right questions, because there's no wrong questions, but asked more questions with a better understanding. Thank you.
Thanks, Elder Carter. Yeah, I think just diving in and asking questions and figuring out what those right questions are is a great piece of advice. Alder Miadze, you have your hand up.
I was just going to add that it's really about meeting people where they're at. When I was elected as an alder, I knocked hundreds of doors in my district, and I was lucky enough to hear from hundreds of residents about what they wanted to see for the District 18. You know, like one of them being the Troy Drive Bridge being done, and you know, it got quickly approved. Working with the mayor and working with the train company and sitting everybody down at the table, but it was really by listening to some of the constituents on what the need was for the district. So if anything I could say was just get together and with other residents and see what the need is and just start advocating for it. And, you know, so I'm so glad to be in that position to be advocating for my constituents. Thank you.
Thanks, Elder Miadze. Thanks for all the work that you and the other alders do in elevating community voice. And I think the amendment process is really a key input in budget development and really bringing those ideas to the forefront. Alder Figueroa Cole.
So I will say that before I became an alder, I honestly, I think it was extremely hard for me to understand what the budget process was, to just even go and look at it on the book online or whatever, and really trying to understand all that terminology there. So really getting acquainted with one thing that came very useful for me was really understanding the funding sources. Like, where is the money coming from? Like that, just that piece of information, it really puts things into perspective and helps you set your expectations, better expectations. And with better expectations, there's less frustration. So last year, I put a blog out during this time of the year explaining the parts of the budget that interest me on regards to public safety. And with this conversation just gave me an idea. Maybe this year I will focus more onto those funding lanes, so people really understand what the limitations are when we are trying to move money around. So yes, the one thing though that you can always ask your alder the details that you need to get that done. But I had to be, totally honest before being confronted with this last year. Understanding the funding sources was key for me to understand how the city moves. So I think that's, and just to maybe elaborate on funding sources, like, again, we had the general fund that comes from taxes, like Dave just explained. We have enterprise funds that are agencies that support themselves based on revenue. We have grants, we have restrictive funds. So that kind of level of detail, it seems like maybe too much, but to me, that put all the puzzles together, all the pieces of the puzzle together. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. Yes, I think that there's a lot of complexity and nuance in the budget. And, sometimes in these kind of general presentations, we don't get into all of the limitations or the specifics. So I agree that sometimes you really need to dive into the details to understand what's going on. And we're going to continue to try building on public engagement efforts and working with the alders to get more information out to the public. So this is kind of our first step, and we'll continue working on building out these resources and tools for all of you. So I really appreciate all of the insight from the alders, and no one from the public has raised their hand yet. So I'm going to assume that we don't have any questions from the audience. Thank you all so much for participating, for coming out tonight. Again, I'm going to quickly share the slide with the next few meetings and how to get in touch if you do have any questions. Yeah, just give me 1 second. So the next time as a member of the public you can register to speak is at tomorrow's Common Council meeting. All meeting registrations are at cityofmadison.com/meeting registration. October 31st will be the Finance Committee deliberation on operating budget amendments. And then we'll have 2 more public hearings at the November 1st and November 15th Common Council. You can always also write to us at financecommittee@cityofmadison.com and all alders at cityofmadison.com to submit written comment. And the alder websites and blogs are also great resources for how to reach your district alder directly. And they're always receptive voices to hearing your concerns and considerations. So with that, thank you all so much for coming out again. The recordings will be available on the city's YouTube channel as well as the budget website. And we hope that you learned a bit about the budget process and are more prepared to be engaged. So thank you and have a great night. Goodbye.